Good morning.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the jury?
My name is Brian Higgins, Higgins.
And where do you live, sir?
Barnstable County, Massachusetts.
And how long have you lived there?
I've owned that property since approximately 2018.
And do you work, sir?
I do.
What do you do for work?
I'm a special agent with the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
And how long have you been doing that?
Just over 15 years.
Now, sir, prior to that, prior to your employment with the ATF, what, if any, other positions, what did you do for work before that?
I was a lieutenant with Cambridge Fire Department.
And how long were you a lieutenant with the Cambridge Fire Department?
I was a lieutenant probably for about 8 years. Total, I was with Cambridge approximately 15 years.
Now, at some point, did you reside in the town of Canton?
I did.
And when was that, sort of what year to what year?
I think that it was shortly after my sister passed away. So it was probably 2017 I purchased that house, and I sold it in January of 2022.
And you recall, was that early January, late January?
On or about January 5th.
And when you sold that property, did you move down to Barnstable County, or did you live somewhere else as well?
For a period of time, I rented an in-law apartment in West Roxbury, and I had my property on Cape Cod as well.
And that in-law property in West Roxbury, that was in 2022 as well?
Yes.
Now, sir, if I could turn your attention to January 28th, 2022 into January 29th of 2022. Do you recall those dates?
Yes.
Do you recall what days of the week those were?
I believe the 28th was Friday, and the 29th was Saturday.
If I could take you back just to at least a day or so before that, but specifically the 28th. On the 28th, where were you on that date initially?
New York City.
And why were you in New York City, sir?
I was in New York City for the funeral services of Officer Mora and Rivera, who were killed in the line of duty.
And fair to say there was a large contingent of law enforcement there?
Yes.
Including several people from Massachusetts?
Yes.
And when did you go down to New York City?
I believe it was the 27th of February. Might have been Thursday.
So was there a wake and a funeral?
There was a wake and the funeral. Some people went to the wake, some people went to the funeral. There was services in over those couple of days.
And you went to the funeral on the 28th, is that correct?
Yes.
And at some point, do you make your way from New York City back towards Massachusetts on the 28th?
Yes.
And do you recall about what time of day that was?
Late morning, possibly.
And why is it that you were coming back on the 28th specifically?
The anticipation of a blizzard.
And how did you drove, is that correct?
I drove my government vehicle down to New York for the services.
And what kind of government vehicle was it that you drove down and back?
That was a Dodge Ram pickup.
Now, on the way back, who, if anyone, came with you for the ride back from New York City to Massachusetts?
Brian Albert, Kevin Albert, and Eddie Hernandez.
And who were they to you, and what, if any, relationship do they have to your work in law enforcement?
Well, first and foremost, they're all friends. Kevin Albert is a detective with the Canton Police Department. Brian Albert was a sergeant detective with the Boston Police Department. Eddie Hernandez, also a detective with the Boston Police Department.
And how long had you known each of these individuals?
So out of the group, Eddie Hernandez would be the person that I knew the longest. I had worked with him back in the early 90s at the Mass General. Then it would probably be Brian Albert. I may have had some contact with him when I was on the Cambridge Fire Department, assigned to the Fire Investigation Unit. And then Kevin Albert would be probably the last in the three that I knew.
Now, speaking to the Canton Police Department at that time, as far as your assignment went with work, where was it that you worked out of, or where was sort of your base of operations, so to say?
Canton PD, I had an office there.
And how was it that you came to have an office in Canton PD?
That relationship was through Chief Berkowitz, born through a tragedy. When my sister passed away, we became friends, and he offered up the space because I had also moved there, so it was close. It was a jumping off point.
And were you the only federal agent that had space within the Canton Police Department?
I was the only one that had an office. I believe there was an HSI agent that might have had some access there to come in, hook up his computer and stuff. And there was also an MBTA police detective, transit police detective, who also had access there. But I was really the only one that maintained a desk, so to speak.
And as far as your work or familiarity with work as far as federal law enforcement officers, is that abnormal to have access to a local PD or have an office or a desk there?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
No, it's not abnormal to have space within a department that you work closely with.
Now, as far as the ride back is concerned, when you drive from New York City back to Massachusetts, about how long a drive was that?
So typically it'd be I'd say like a 4-hour ride depending on traffic. This was longer, and I would also factor in the fact that we stopped and ate on the way back.
And when you arrived back to Massachusetts, where specifically in Massachusetts is it that you first go?
So the first place that we went was a Boston Police Department district in Charlestown, where Brian Albert and Eddie Hernandez had parked their vehicles.
Now, as far as you know, had they driven down to New York City, or how would they come to be in New York City, if you know?
I believe that Brian Albert, Eddie Hernandez, and Kevin Albert all flew down to New York.
And they drove back with you because of the storm, is that fair to say?
Yes.
Now, after dropping them off there, where did you go from there?
I went back to the Canton Police Department where I dropped off Kevin Albert, and then switched vehicles, got into my Jeep Wrangler, and I traveled up to the Hillside in Canton.
Now, as far as traveling up to the Hillside in Canton, who, if anyone, did you have plans with, or who, if anyone, did you coordinate with as far as going to the Hillside?
Brian Albert agreed to meet me there.
And as far as switching from your government vehicle to a personal vehicle, is that correct?
Yes,
And why did you do that before going to the Hillside?
because I was technically no longer on duty, so to speak, even though I had been at a funeral. But, I knew I would be consuming alcohol, and we have a policy against that.
Now, as far as vehicles related to you, whether they be personal or work in the Canton PD, how many vehicles did you have at that location?
So I would have had my government truck that I parked there. I would have had a surveillance vehicle that I parked there. And at times, it would sometimes flip in and out between a pickup truck that I had and the Jeep itself.
And the Jeep that you were driving that night, can you describe the Jeep, sort of what it looked like, what kind of Jeep it was?
So it's a 2011 Jeep Wrangler, gray in color. And at the time that I was driving it on the 28th and the 29th the next day, it had a plow on it.
And the plow that you had affixed to the Jeep Wrangler, is that, how big a plow are we talking about?
If I was to guess, it was probably 6 feet 8 inches. I believe they make them in two formats, 6'8" and I think 7'2". But I believe I have the smaller blade on that Jeep.
And how often would you have, was that like a year-round thing, or how often, when about would you have that plow affixed to the Jeep?
Inclement weather or impending inclement weather.
And is that something that you used, as far as what if any use did you put the plow on the front of the Jeep to?
To help family and friends clear the property at the Cape. I had used it when I had the house in Canton.
And so you go to the Hillside, and do you know about what time it was that you got there?
No, again, it would have been after I dropped off Kevin Albert. Definitely would have been dark at that time.
And the Hillside, is that an establishment that you're familiar with? You had been there before?
Yes.
And about how long was it after you arrived that Brian Albert arrived?
Shortly thereafter, probably, because I had traveled back, dropped the vehicle off. He may have even beat me there because I went to the station and dropped Kevin off, but I don't think it was contemporaneous, but it was in close proximity.
And once you got to the Hillside, how long were you there, and how long was Mr. Albert there?
So I had something to eat. I had something to drink. The approximate time, maybe an hour or so, and then Brian had left before me. I remained, he left.
And if you know, about how long before you left was it that Brian Albert left?
Can you repeat that again?
Sure. Brian Albert left before you, correct?
Yes.
About how long before you left was it that Brian Albert left?
Maybe 15 minutes.
And you had some drinks at the Hillside, is that correct?
I did.
And do you recall what you drank that night?
Usually what I drink all the time, Jameson and ginger.
And as far as where Mr. Albert was going, what, if any, conversation did you have about that?
He had told me that he was going down to the Waterfall Bar and Grill, which is in Canton Center, and that he'd be meeting his wife and some family and maybe some other people.
And were you invited to come along?
Yes.
Now, the Waterfall, that's an establishment you're familiar with. You've been there previous times as well.
Yes.
And with respect to this evening, so you leave from the Hillside and you go directly to the Waterfall?
Yes.
And if you know, about what time was it that you got to the Waterfall?
Again, it was dark. It could have been around 9 in the area, 9 o'clock.
And when you get to the Waterfall, do you recall where in relation to the Waterfall you parked the Jeep at that time?
No.
So you come in to the Waterfall, and where do you go?
I went to a series. I saw Brian and his family, and there was a series of high tops, and I proceeded to the high tops where they were.
Now, with respect to Brian Albert, how would you describe sort of your relationship around this time in January 2022?
He's a good friend. He's a coworker. I had been working closely with his unit. I'd say he was a good friend.
And through that sort of work and your friendship, were you familiar with his family as well?
Yes.
And so when you came over to the area where Brian Albert was, his wife was there, correct?
Yes.
And who, if anyone else, was there that you were familiar with or that you knew when you came?
So it would have been Brian Albert. It would have been Nicole. I believe Caitlin was there. Caitlin Albert, Brian's daughter. Chris Albert, his wife, Julie. There might have been another couple, Matt McCabe and Jim McCabe.
And as far as the McCabe's were concerned, how familiar were you with them?
Casually.
Now, at some point you come in, you join the group, is that correct?
Yes.
And how would you describe sort of, throughout the entirety of the evening or your time at the Waterfall, how would you describe sort of the mood or the demeanor of the group within the bar?
It was a good time.
No arguments or anything like that you observed from anybody that was present over the course of?
No, it was a good time, and there was a band.
And if you recall, about what time was it that you left?
I would say right around when the band was wrapping up. So it was probably closer to midnight.
Now, prior to that, at some point between the time that you arrived and the time that the band's wrapping up and you're preparing to leave, who, if anyone else that you were familiar with, came into the Waterfall?
John O'Keefe and the defendant.
And just to be clear, when you're referencing the defendant, what is her name?
Karen Reed?
And just to be clear for the record, do you see Ms. Reed in the courtroom today?
I do.
Could you identify just as to where she's seated or an article of clothing that she's wearing?
She's seated between attorneys Jackson and Yannetti.
And just ask the record to reflect identification of the defendant by the witness.
Yes.
Now, with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, starting there, as far as how long had you known Mr. O'Keefe?
Maybe a year, a little over a year.
And do you recall how it was or where it was that you first met Mr. O'Keefe?
I believe it was actually the Hillside.
And how often would it be that you saw Mr. O'Keefe or socialized with Mr. O'Keefe?
I would see him at the Hillside.
And as far as, were you familiar with what Mr. O'Keefe did for work?
Yes. And
what were you familiar with him doing for work?
He was a Boston police officer.
And with reference to Ms. Reed, how long had you known the defendant?
It would be about the same time, or as long as.
And so roughly, what was your understanding as far as the relationship between Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed?
They were dating.
Now, with reference to occasions, as far as would there be occasions typically where you would see Mr. O'Keefe without Ms. Reed, or you would see Ms. Reed without Mr. O'Keefe, or were they essentially together when you saw them?
I would say more often than not, they'd be together.
And did you have occasion to see them at other sort of social settings outside of the Hillside?
I went over the house one time for the end of Patriots game.
So if I could take you back, let me ask you this. As far as how would you describe your relationship with John O'Keefe?
I considered him a friend.
And how would you describe your relationship with Ms. Reed?
I considered her a friend as well.
Now, through the course of time that you knew them, did you have occasion to get their contact information and have communication with each of them through their phones?
I had John and I had exchanged telephone numbers.
And with reference to those communications, were they texts, were they phone calls, or varied?
Oh, they would be text.
And as far as the text communications that you had, you received this contact information, you texted, someone replied. How did you know that that was John O'Keefe that was replying to you?
Well, I had him saved in my phone, John O'Keefe. I don't know exactly where he gave me his phone number, but I knew it was him.
Now, on that evening, taking you back to the Waterfall, January 28th into January 29th, do you know about what time it was that Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant came into the Waterfall?
It would have been, I think, between like 11 and closing.
And do you recall sort of where you were situated in reference to the table when they came in?
So I think I was at the high top bar area, the high top in the bar area closest to the bar.
And when Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed came into the Waterfall, what, if anything, did you observe? Where did they go when they first came in?
So when they first came in, I believe they may have initially went in, like, veered off in different directions. I recall that she opened her coat and took a drink out of it. I should say a glass.
And what, if any, observations did you make of the glass that Ms. Reed took out of her coat?
It was a tall glass. It looked like a clear liquid in there.
And at some point, did you come to find out where Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed had been prior to coming to the Waterfall?
Sustained.
Are you familiar with another establishment in Canton called C.F. McCarthy's?
Yes.
Is that a place that you've been to before?
Yes.
Now, as far as the glass that you saw with reference to the Waterfall and or C.F. McCarthy's, what, if any, observations did you make of it?
Well, that it wasn't from the Waterfall.
And what makes you say that?
Well, she walked in with it and took it out of her coat, but it wasn't consistent with the type of glasses that the Waterfall had.
And so let me just ask one further question in regard to that. So when you say it wasn't consistent, what was it about it that made it inconsistent with glasses from the Waterfall?
I believe it was a tall glass and kind of like bubbles on the side of it, so to speak, like the design.
Now, after you make those observations, at some point over the course of the time that you were at the Waterfall and they were there as well, did you have occasion to have a conversation with Mr. O'Keefe?
I did. I don't know that if it was initially when he first came in, but I did have a brief conversation with him as to the content. I don't recall what that was.
Just small talk, fair to say?
Greetings.
And with regard to Ms. Reed, during your time at the Waterfall, what, if any, conversations did you have with her?
I did not have any.
Now, at this point in time on this date, did you have Ms. Reed's cell phone information
I did not.
at the time that you were at the Waterfall?
No.
Do you recall sending a text or
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that question again?
at this time, I know we've jumped around a couple of days, but at this time that you were at the Waterfall on the 28th or the 29th, did you have Ms. Reed's contact?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And at some point over the course of the evening while you were at the Waterfall, did you send a text to Ms. Reed?
I did.
And do you recall what the substance of that text was?
I think it was something like, well,
And do you recall what it meant as far as that text message or why you had sent that to her?
to be honest with you, it was, I guess you could view it as a flirty text.
Now, around midnight or so, when you leave the Waterfall, well, I'm sorry, let me take it back just one step. At some point over the course of the evening while you're at the Waterfall, what, if any, discussion is there around the table as far as next steps or where to go from there?
Well, there was talk at the table, I think initially about going back to Chris Albert's Pizza Shop to have some food and drink. And at some point that transitioned into going back to Brian Albert's house.
And as far as the invitation to go back to Brian Albert's house, was that something that was extended to the entirety of the table?
I took it as an open invitation to the people that were together at the table, yes.
And Mr. Albert's house, is that somewhere that you had been to before?
I had been there, the twins' graduation party, which was outside in the backyard. And I think I may have dropped him off on one occasion. I may have dropped something in his mailbox, but those would be the only other times.
And are you familiar, at least now, with the address and sort of where you were going? Did you know where you were going that night?
I knew where I was going, yes.
And the address was 34 Fairview Road.
That is correct, yes.
And about what time? About midnight or so when you're leaving. Who, if anyone, was leaving the bar around the same time?
I mean, I think pretty much everybody was wrapping up and leaving. I know that I beat Brian and Nicole back to the house.
Now, as far as the time at the Waterfall, with reference to either Mr. O'Keefe or Ms. Reed, what, if any, observations did you make in regard to what they were drinking that night?
I think John was having beers, is his typical, what I would see him with. And the defendant had, glasses.
And do you recall her ever, at any point that you were there, if you recall, drinking out of a glass different than the one she took out of her coat when she first arrived?
I don't recall.
Now, you drove from the Waterfall to Fairview Road. About how long a drive was that?
Probably a few minutes. But the weather was, I remember when I came out, I put the wipers on. There was some snow on the ground, but it was the type of snow where the roadway was still black at the time, but because it was being driven on, but the sidewalk had a light coating. And
you drive over to the home, and you mentioned that you beat Mr. Albert there. Is that correct?
I did.
And so with regard to the home, when you get there, what did you do when you got there?
Well, I was kind of being a smart ass, and I dropped the plow, and I did a little sweep of the driveway, and then I got out of the driveway because I didn't want to get blocked in, and I parked.
And do you recall where you parked in relation to the house?
I do, by the mailbox.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, if I could publish what's been marked as Exhibit 72.
Okay.
And Mr. Higgins, do you recognize what's printed up on the screen there?
I do.
And what do you recognize that?
34 Fairview.
Sorry, may I approach on?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins, I'm going to give you a laser pointer and just press that button there. So, Mr. Higgins, with that laser pointer now in your hand, if you could direct the jury's attention to, if you see it in this photograph, where you parked your Jeep at.
So the back end of the Jeep would have been right around the mailbox itself. And the edge of the driveway is right there. I wanted to make sure that I was not blocking the driveway or blocked in.
And so the front of your vehicle would have been pointed in which direction?
I believe that'd be going towards Chapman Street.
And so which part of your vehicle was closest to the house? So the driver's side or the passenger side?
So the passenger side would be closest to the house.
So you parked along the front of the house sort of with traffic, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, you can take that down. Thank you. So you arrive at the house, you do, as far as the maneuver with the plow in the driveway, and then you park the vehicle, and where is it that you go from there?
Into the house.
And when you get into the house, who, if anyone, is there, or who, if anyone, is coming in with you?
So I might have been there, well, it was about the same time that Brian and Nicole showed up. I don't know if they entered before me or I entered after them. I entered the house. What I recollect is that Brian Albert Jr. is sitting kind of at the island or in the island area, and I believe he was flanked by at least one female, possibly two, one on each side.
And either of those females, did you know them? Did you recognize them? Did you know who they were?
I may have recognized one I've seen before, but I didn't know them.
And just lastly, before we go back into the house, when you park, when you do the sort of plowing in the driveway and then parking, did you see Mr. Albert arrive at the house around that time?
When I parked the Jeep?
Yes.
Well, yes. So I made the sweep, and as I could see the vehicle coming up, I made the sweep, got out of the way so he could park.
So he had parked in the driveway around the time that you're parking on the street?
Yes.
And so when you come into the house and you see the people that you've described, where were they situated within the house?
So I came through what I would call like a breezeway door. So there's a front door to the residence, there's the garages, and in between there is a like a breezeway door. I came in through there, and it's kind of like you're in the kitchen. I think there's like an island, so to speak. You may be able to sit at it, and Brian Albert Jr. was right there, and again flanked by one, if not two, females.
Now, at some point after your arrival, who, if anyone else that you were familiar with, came by the house?
I believe it was Jen and Matt McCabe.
You know about how long it was after you arrived that they arrived?
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it was much longer. People started, float in at that point.
And beyond sort of the kitchen area that you were describing before, where else did you go within the house that night?
At one point, briefly, Brian Albert showed me some photographs, family. I believe primarily it might have been of his son who had recently been in the Marine Corps. Gone into, I should say.
And do you recall, or why was he showing you specifically like those photographs of his son in the Marine Corps?
Because he's proud.
Now, let me ask you this. As far as yourself and or Mr. Albert, what, if any, familiarity or what, if any, background do you or Mr. Albert have with regard to the military?
Brian was in the Marine Corps. I was in the Army.
Now, this period that you're talking about in the other room, about how long a period was that?
It was brief.
And beyond yourself and Mr. Albert, was there anyone else from the group that you described that was in the room at the same time as you and Mr. Albert?
I don't think so. I think Nicole may have popped in for a second, but I'm not 100% positive on that.
And as far as, do you know approximately what time you left the house on Fairview that evening?
I'd guesstimate it was anywhere between 12:30 and 1 o'clock, but I'm not 100% positive.
So relatively short period of time, is that correct?
It was a short period of time. I knew kind of from the onset when I got in there, it probably wasn't going to be a long time because I'm not a beer drinker and that's what they had. So I was probably one of the first people to leave.
Now, for that entirety of the time that you were there, did you go anywhere else within the home beyond what you've described as far as the kitchen and the living room?
No,
Did you go upstairs at any time?
no,
Did you go downstairs in any sort of basement area at any time?
no.
And when you exited the home, do you recall which of the two doors that you described that you would have exited from?
The same door I came in, the breezeway.
Now, during the time that you were there, similar to what I asked about the waterfall, how would you describe sort of the mood or demeanor within the home?
It was fine. I mean, everybody was happy.
And at any point in time while you were at 34 Fairview, do you, any of the people that were in the house, do you recall seeing them go outside of the house and come back or anything like that?
I can't say definitively I saw anybody come in or out of the house, but I think somebody might have been in the process of maybe being picked up.
And not anybody that you were super familiar with, is that fair to say?
I think it was one of the females.
Now, with respect to the front of the house, at any point in time that you were inside of the house, was your attention drawn or did you look out the windows or the door or anything like that?
No.
And when you were in the kitchen area, do you recall sort of how you were positioned in relation to the windows facing the front of the house?
So I would have had my back to that area, my back to the door that I came in.
And specifically with reference to Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed, at any point in time, did you see either of them inside the house or outside of the house or around the house or anywhere around 34 Fairview Road?
Absolutely not, no.
And at any point in time over the course of the evening, what, if any, communication or text or anything did you send to either of those two people while you were at the house on Fairview?
While I was at the house, I think I shot a text just to John. Where are you? I think that's what it was.
And if you recall, did you ever get a response to that text?
No, there was no response.
So after you left the waterfall, when you left the waterfall, was Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed, the defendant, still there?
I can't say 100% no.
But after you left the waterfall, at any point in time, did you speak to, text with, or communicate in any way, shape, or form, or see in any way, shape, or form either Mr. O'Keefe or Ms. Reed?
Well, again, the only person I shot the text to while I was at the house was John, but after I left the waterfall, I never saw John O'Keefe or the defendant again.
Now, when you left from the residence, and again, you're not sure what time that was?
Between 12:30 and 1 o'clock.
And do you recall who amongst the group was still at the house at the time you left?
I think I was probably the first person to leave.
So all of the other people that you've described would have still been in the house when you exited from the house?
Yes.
Now, you indicated earlier that you're familiar with Mr. Albert and his family to some extent, correct?
Yes.
You've been to his house for a graduation party for his twins, correct?
Yes.
Through that, at any point in time prior to this date, did you become aware or familiar with Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert?
I know the name, and I know that he is one of the sons of Chris Albert.
Are you familiar with what he looks like?
If he walked in here right now, I wouldn't know.
You would not know?
No.
And beyond the people that you've described as far as seeing at 34 Fairview Road, fair to say you don't recall anybody being introduced or identified as Colin Albert?
No.
Now, you exit from the home through the breezeway door and go over to your vehicle, is that right?
Yes.
And from the time that you would enter the home to the time now that you're exiting from the home, what, if any, change did you note as far as the weather intermittently?
Just that the weather was getting worse. The snow was picking up.
And as far as the accumulation that you had described before, as far as you could still see the blacktop and all that when you left the waterfall, what was it like when you came out of the house?
Again, I think that the streets that weren't being traveled, there was snow on them. There was coverage.
And as far as the front lawn area of the house at 34 Fairview Road, what, if any, observations did you make of that?
Can you rephrase that?
Sure. As far as the snow was concerned, was the
Yes.
snow sticking to, or was it accumulating on the lawn as well?
I believe so. I mean, when I walked from the breezeway to the Jeep, there was snow on the ground.
Now, the front yard area of the house, is that something that you were looking at with any particularity or taking note of as you were walking your Jeep down the driveway?
No, it was a long day. We had been on the road. I just was looking to get home.
And so when you get to your Jeep, can you describe to the jury sort of how it was that you pulled away, or what, if anything, you recall about that process?
So I got in the Jeep, started it up, may have looked at my phone, put it in drive and started to pull away. And then I'm like, put the plow up. So I reached, I moved a couple of feet. I heard it grinding on the ground, reached for the device called a fish stick, picked it up, lifted the plow, and then drove away. And the plow that you had affixed to the front of the Jeep, how is, I think you've talked a little bit about it, but how is that sort of controlled, and who controls that? So the operator controls it. The mechanism to control it, again, is called a fish stick. It's on a cord, and it plugs in under the dashboard. I reached down to find out, I don't know if it was on the floor or between the seats, but it's not like a joystick that's attached actually to the dashboard. So some sort of hydraulic system, is that correct? Yes, it's hydraulic based. Now, in addition to moving it sort of up and down, is there any other way that you can manipulate the blade as far as that switch is concerned? Yeah, so if I would generally, if I'm driving around town and I'm not worried about the vehicle heating up, I just lift the plow off a couple feet off the ground. If I was on the highway, I would tilt it to get airflow. And as far as height is concerned for that plow, if you were to lift it all the way to the top, what, if any, impact would that have with reference to your line of sight or visibility through the windshield? Zero. So even if it's raised all the way as far as it can go, you can still see over the top of the blade? Yeah, if it comes even with the hood of the Jeep, I'd be surprised. So you pull forward a couple of feet, and then you lift it. About how high did you lift it when you're pulling, when you stop and then lift up? Probably like a foot or two. And as far as following that, you pull away from the house, is that right? Correct. And as you're pulling away from the house, where is your attention drawn, or what, if anything, did you see as far as when you're pulling away from the house? Wasn't drawn to anything. I just drove away. And when you drove away, again, during that process, did you see anything outside of the house that drew concern or your attention or anything like that? No. Now, as far as when you get out to your vehicle and you're driving away, were there any other vehicles on the street that you saw in the area of the residence at 34 Fairview? I didn't see any. And do you recall whether or not there were any tire tracks in the snow or anything that you saw when you came out to the vehicle, if you recall? I do not recall. Now, you leave the residence at 34 Fairview, and where did you go from there? I went back to the Canton Police. And why was it that you went back to the Canton Police Station? Well, we had traveled down for the services for those police officers, and we anticipated staying the following day. I think I had said that we left a day earlier. So I had left a key to the surveillance vehicle on top of my desk so that somebody could move the vehicle, because a lot of times Chief Berkowitz would get after me. As a courtesy, I was parking vehicles there, sometimes my personal, but primarily my work vehicles. And one thing he asked me, just leave the vehicles in the middle of the parking lot so that snow could be cleared. So the reason for heading back there was to move those vehicles, because if I didn't do it then, I would have had to get up early and do it. And I also know they plow through the night, so that would be the reason for heading back. Before we get a little more into that, as far as the funeral that you went to, were these people that you knew or had met or were familiar with? No. So you get back to the police station, and
with regard to the Canton Police Station, what, if any, access did you have to the Canton PD, and sort of how did you facilitate that?
So I would describe it as a proxy card. The doors have card readers. Generally in the parking lot, when you come into the police station, you drive in. Sally ports are off to your right-hand side. There's two bay doors there. There's a pass-through door, and then over in the corner would typically where I would bury both vehicles. So if I was, typically it would be my take-home pickup truck that I described earlier, and it would be the surveillance vehicle. But if I had, that could be swapped out with one of my personal vehicles. I would leave a personal vehicle there if I took one of those two vehicles. And then for me to access into the building, the most direct door would be that pass-through door by the Sally port.
And sort of that back area, is that typically where you would park?
Yes.
And just in reference to you talk about a surveillance vehicle, that's something that you use as far as conducting surveillance and performance of your duties as a law enforcement officer?
Yes.
And so fair to say that would not be something you would want to park, like, say, in front of the police station?
No.
Now, that path that you took, is that the typical path that you would take, sort of park to the back and then cut through the Sally port into the station?
Yes, that would be the route that I would go.
And if you recall, is that the route that you went on that particular early morning when you came back to the station?
I believe it is.
And when you come back to the station and you go in, where are you going within the police station when you enter?
So I'm going up to I was going up to my office to grab the key for that surveillance vehicle. So when you come through that pass-through door at the Sally port, the first door would be through the booking and the holding area that directly goes into the dispatch area. But if you walk to the extreme other end, there's another door on the other end, common hallway. I'd walk down that hallway, hit a set of stairs, and I would go up that way.
Now, if I could take you back just for a second, as far as when you initially walk into the Sally port area, that's a garage, basically, correct?
Yes.
And when you come into the garage, the door that you would then enter to come into the station, where is that in relation to the door that you come from the exterior? How far away are the two?
So if you come into, I guess what you're asking, so if I come into the Sally port, immediately to the right, there's the door that goes into the holding area, booking area, and then probably it's probably 12 feet long to get to the other door.
So from where you're parking and where you come into the Sally port, it's not like you then have to walk across the garage or anything like that to get to the door into the station, is that correct?
Well, you do walk across the garage, but it's small.
And when you say small, about how far?
About 12 feet, maybe?
And so you come into the station, you go by the dispatch, is that correct?
So as I'm walking down the hallway, dispatch would be off to the right. It's a wooden door with two glass panes.
And as far as the Canton Police Station is concerned, are you familiar with, or were you aware at the time that there is sort of security and cameras and such around the station?
Yes.
You're aware that those cameras record, is that correct?
Yes.
And are you aware of any records that are generated as far as your key card access when you go through a certain door at a certain time?
Well, I've never seen those records, but it's my understanding it tracks access control.
And did you happen to go by the dispatch area specifically? And if so, do you know who was working there that night?
Newly promoted Sergeant Good, I believe. Probably, he was on midnights.
Do you have any specific recollection of seeing him there that evening or that early morning when you came by?
I believe I waved to him.
And as far as when you get to the police station, do you have how far drive is it from Fairview to the police station, if you know?
Well, I mean, the weather was picking up, so it probably took me a little bit longer to get back, but it's probably 5-10 minutes maybe.
Now, the key that you went to your office to get a key, correct?
Yes.
And why had you left the key to one of the vehicles in the office?
So as I stated earlier, I anticipated not even being back in Massachusetts, knew the storm was coming, didn't know how bad it was, but I left the key on the desk to facilitate somebody being able to move that.
And so you go to your office, you get the key, and then where did you go from there?
I go back downstairs and I move the vehicles to the center of the parking lot.
And then at some point you leave, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know about how long it was after you moved the vehicles around that you left Canton PD?
Not long, but I'd be guessing if I gave you a time.
And so where did you go from there?
I went back to West Roxbury.
And which vehicle that you've described, which of those vehicles did you use to get from Canton PD to West Roxbury?
The Jeep Cherokee, Jeep Wrangler, sorry.
And if you know about what time was it that you got home to West Roxbury?
Could have been somewhere around 20 or 2. I'm not 100% positive.
So sometime between 1:30 and 2 a.m., is that roughly around?
Yes.
And when you get home, do you recall like what it was that you did when you got home?
Well, it was a long day. We had traveled, the traffic, it just seemed like it dragged on forever. But I think I did what I typically do after being out, having a couple of drinks. I had something else to eat, and I believe I might have had another couple of drinks and either laid on the couch or laid on my bed. And typically I would fall asleep if I was on the couch and wake up and go into the bedroom. I don't know what location I was in at that point.
Now, after you fall asleep at some point later on that morning or something, you wake up obviously at some period, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall what it was that awoke you on that morning?
I mean, for lack of better words, my phone, both my work and my personal phones were blowing up. They were going off.
And if you know about what time in the morning was that occurred?
Probably around 6:30-ish.
And who, if anyone, as far as you looked at your phones, and who, if anyone, was blowing up your phone, or who was calling you at that?
Well, I think first it was Chief Berkowitz, and then Brian Albert.
And you mentioned first it was Chief Berkowitz. Did you answer the chief's call at that time?
No.
And was that abnormal for the chief to be calling you at that time of day?
No, he's an early riser, and typically when he was working, again, we also had a friendship. He would call in the morning, kind of like checking in with each other. So I just kind of blew, like, why are you calling me this early? Kind of just blew it off. But then when I saw Brian Albert calling me, like, that kind of caused me some concern, because I'm like, why is he calling me? He was out with me all day yesterday. We both had the same long day, and I was concerned at that point.
And so you answer the phone from Mr. Albert, is that correct?
Yes.
And what, if anything, did you learn from him, or what, if anything, did he tell you?
Objection.
I'm going to sustain the objection at this point.
So you receive a call from him and you have some sort of conversation, correct?
Yes.
Now, prior to that, from the time that you got home to the time that you answered this call from Brian Albert, do you recall having any phone calls or conversations with anybody during that time period?
No.
And specifically, did you talk to Brian Albert on the phone at any point between the time you left his home and the time that you woke up the next morning to his phone call?
No, I did not.
Now, the previous day, over the course of it, we're all waking up in New York and then driving home and going to the Hillside and going to the Waterfall and going to Mr. Albert's house. Had you and Mr. Albert communicated via cell phone, whether it be text or phone call at any point in time during the course of that day?
You mean the day before?
Yes.
Yes.
So he was fairly recent in your contacts, is that correct?
Yes.
And so as far as that phone call that you received from Mr. Albert, based on whatever information that you learned from that, what did you do then?
I got dressed and went right over to the house at 34 Fairview.
And when you left your house in West Roxbury and went back to 34 Fairview, what were you driving at that point?
I was still in the Jeep Wrangler.
And if you know about what time or so was it that you arrived back at 34 Fairview late that morning?
Maybe a little after 7.
And when you arrived there, what, if anything, did you see?
I mean, I just went into the house.
As far as outside of the house, when you arrived there, what, if anything, did you see outside the house?
I don't recall, maybe a police car. I don't remember.
Now, with regard to, starting with the weather, when you woke up and you were driving back to 34 Fairview, what was the weather like at that point in reference to when you had gotten home to West Roxbury the night before?
It was real bad.
And as far as when you get to the house at 34 Fairview, sometime around 7 a.m. or so, where is it that you parked in relation to the home at that point?
I might have went in the driveway. I don't remember specifically where I parked.
And as far as other vehicles there, how many other vehicles, were there more or less vehicles there that morning than there were when you were there the night before?
I couldn't say definitively.
And when you come into the house, who, if anyone, is it that you see inside the house when you get there?
So I saw Brian, I saw Nicole. Brian Jr. may have popped in and out of the same kitchen area that I was in before. Jen and Matt McCabe. And then a short time later, Julie Albert showed up.
And Julie Albert, when she showed up, what, if anything, did you observe her to have with her when she showed up?
Like box of donuts or muffins or something like that.
And as far as the house when you come in, sort of the evening before, but how would you describe sort of the mood and demeanor of the people in the house when you arrived there later on that morning, sometime around 7 or so?
People were pretty distraught
And did you know why they were distraught?
because John had been found on the lawn.
And is that why you had gone to the house?
Yes.
And when you received that information or were informed of that, how did you receive that information, or what, if any, impact did that have on you?
Well,
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustain, you can ask it differently.
When did you first learn of Mr. O'Keefe being found on the lawn at 34 Fairview?
during the phone call at about 6:30-ish when Brian Albert, when I spoke with him.
And what was your reaction when you received that information?
It didn't make sense to me. I couldn't do the math in my head because I know John O'Keefe and the defendant never showed up. It didn't make sense.
And so from this time that you're in the house, do you recall any sort of conversation about within the group as far as what was going on?
Objection.
Do you recall that there was a conversation?
Yes, I recall that there was conversation and it's
Objection.
Just that.
okay.
Next question, Mr. Lally.
Now, from the time that you arrived there later on that morning, about how long a period of time were you there for?
Less than an hour.
And from there, where did you go from there?
I don't know if I went back to the police station or I went to West Roxbury. Might have been the police station.
And if you went to the police station, why would you have gone to the police station at that point?
Because I was still trying to put things together in my head. I was upset. Those would be the reasons.
Do you recall whether or not, bless you, do you recall whether or not you were at the police station that day?
Yes,
No, I'll allow it.
yes, I'm pretty sure I was there.
And do you know about how long you were there or about what time it was that you were there?
No, I couldn't say specifically.
And after you left the police station that day, where did you go from there?
At some point, I probably went back to West Roxbury. I don't specifically remember.
Now, again, from when you went, maybe fairly simple question, but as far as you drove the Jeep Wrangler from West Roxbury back to Fairview Road that morning, correct?
Yes,
And then you drove that Jeep Wrangler from Fairview Road to the Canton Police Station at some point during the day?
I believe I was in that vehicle all day.
Now, at some point, a few days following this, did you have occasion to meet with some troopers from the state police?
I did.
And do you recall who those troopers were?
Trooper Proctor and Trooper Buchanan.
And were you familiar with those troopers prior to that date that you met with them?
So I was familiar with Trooper Buchanan. Evidently, I was reminded by Trooper Proctor that I had met him before. I think I helped him on a gun recovery that he made, but I didn't remember him.
And as far as you mentioned, sort of socializing with other officers from law enforcement, had you ever socialized with either Sergeant Buchanan or Trooper Proctor before?
So Trooper Proctor, no. I had seen Trooper Buchanan on a number of occasions at a local gym. I had seen him one time at the Hillside. I think he might have been with his child after a sporting event. I think I said hello. I bought him a drink, but I wouldn't classify that as socializing, more being friendly. But I also that area of responsibility, the South Shore, south of Boston, Cape and Islands, I was assigned to a group where I would interface with people in that area, and that Norfolk CPAC office would be people that over the years I've probably dealt with.
Now, when you met with him on this day, do you recall specifically what day it was?
No.
If I said February 3rd, would that sound about right, or if you know?
I would say in that area.
And when you met with them, you had a conversation with them or an interview in regard to what had transpired on the 28th and 29th, correct?
Yes.
And following sort of the substance of that interview, what, if anything, did you provide the troopers with?
I provided them with text messages that I had exchanged and had on my phone with John O'Keefe, and text messages that I had exchanged with the defendant.
And how did you, in what sort of format did you provide those text messages to the troopers?
Well, they were copies, and I believe that the format would be, the way to categorize it, screenshots.
And how is it that you sort of generated these from your phone?
I consulted a coworker, who's also a friend, and he has the training with the cell phones. I told him I wanted to provide these to the state police. What is the best way that I can get them off my phone and provide them to law enforcement?
And why was it that you felt it was important, or why is it that you wanted to share those with the troopers?
Well, I thought it was important because I've had communication with the both of them, and I wanted to be fully transparent.
Now, with reference to either or both of those communications with Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed, the material that you provided to the troopers, what, if anything, did you do to that material before giving it to them?
Nothing.
So as far as the material or the text that you provided to the troopers, that was what was on your phone?
Yes.
There was no deletions, no excising any material, nothing like that before you gave it to the troopers?
No. Exactly what was on my phone, I provided to them.
And specifically, as you were providing it to them or shortly thereafter, did you have a conversation with Sergeant Buchanan in reference to that very topic? If you recall.
No, I don't recall.
Do you recall him asking you anything about, as far as if this was the entirety of what you had provided?
So I think during the actual interview, he specifically asked me, are these, I would say in sum and substance, he said, you know, is this an accurate representation? Has anything been deleted? And I said, no. I mean, as with respects to the text with the defendant, from the first time that she reached out to me and texted me, nothing had been deleted. As far as John's text string, we might have had older text strings that were deleted, but that was what I gave him. What I gave the troopers was exactly when I captured everything is exactly it is what it is. Everything that was on those phones was provided. Nothing was deleted.
And as far as when you provided these text communications to the troopers, was that something that they had asked for, or was that something that you volunteered?
I volunteered that to them.
And upon them sort of receiving them from you, did they have further questions beyond what they had already asked you based on what you provided?
I believe they got into other specific questions, specifically in relation to John O'Keefe and the defendant, as far as intimacy and things like that. There was more detailed questions that followed.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes.
Thank you. Sure, I'm going to show you two documents. One. One is 12 pages long, one is 56 pages long. If you can just look at those briefly and familiarize yourself with them, look up when you And do you recognize what those are, sir?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Sure. My apologies. Do you recognize what those are, sir?
Yes.
And what do you recognize those to be?
So those are the two documents that I provided to the troopers during the interview.
And the shorter one, who, if any, one is those communications with?
John O'Keefe,
And the longer one, about 56 pages long or so, who, if any, one of those communications with?
the defendant.
May I approach you?
Yes.
Almost introduce in a minute.
Okay. So we'll do them separately, please, so that the first 12-page one. Okay.
May I return both of those to the witness?
Yes.
I'm going to direct your attention first to what's marked as Exhibit 103. And is that the communications, or the text communications that you had with Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
And sir, if I could turn your attention to the first sort of content within that, just in reference to what is the date of the first sort of exchange in these text communications between yourself and Mr. O'Keefe?
Wednesday, November 24th.
And in general, can you describe for the jury what that conversation was about on Wednesday, November 24th?
He basically, it's kind of hard to read, I apologize, but it looks like he's just reached out to me. He said, "What's up, Pell? where are we going to hang local? We are going to hang local. Are you drinking?
So he's out, he's trying to see where you are and if you want to meet up.
Yes.
Now, sir, if I could direct your attention to the last page within those documents you have before you. So with reference to, there's some conversation on the bottom of that last page from Sunday, January 16th, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you had mentioned that with respect to Mr. O'Keefe, you had been over his house on a prior occasion to watch the Patriots game, correct?
Yes.
And when was that in relation to this date that we've been talking about as far as the 28th and the 29th? How long before?
So it was the 16th.
So
Might have
that-
been the 15th into the 16th, I believe.
So that text on the 16th was either same day or the day following when you had gone over there to watch the Patriots game?
Well, we're the text where I asked if I broke his nephew's toy video game would have been the next day.
Now, in reference to Mr. O'Keefe, you described that he was a friend of yours, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, where you used to live in Canton, where was that or how close was that in relation to where Mr. O'Keefe lived on Meadows Ave?
Not far at all. Several blocks.
Now, prior to you going over there for the Patriots game, at some point, or had you been over to his home at any previous time?
So I reached out. We had inclement weather. It might have been around the beginning of January, maybe 6th to 7th. And I shot him a text and said, do you want me to clear the driveway for you?
So using the same plow that you were talking about before, you had offered to clear out his driveway.
Yes.
Now, on this occasion that you go over there for the Patriots game, prior to that, had the two of you had any conversation or had you been invited to go over there with reference to football games before?
Yes, a number of times at the Hillside, I was asked, hey, we're going to watch the last half at the house. You want to come by? Things like that, yes.
And had you ever taken Mr. O'Keefe up on any of those prior invitations to come by the house and watch it?
No.
And so on this particular game, do you recall why it was that you took him up on it this time and went over?
Well, I felt bad. I had never been over there. I've been asked repeatedly. I knew it was probably going to be the last game for the season. And I had also independently got a text of an invite from John himself and then also from the defendant independently.
Now, in reference to you thinking it was going to be the last game of the season, do you recall, was it a regular season game, playoff game? Who were they playing? Do you recall any of that?
I think it might have been the Bills. I don't know if it was the playoffs or it was just another game to me, but I knew it was probably going to be the last game.
And so if you recall that evening, about what time was it that you stopped by Mr. O'Keefe's house?
Oh, it was like just before the game ended, not long after.
So pretty far into the second half of the game by the time you arrived.
Oh, yeah.
And in addition to Mr. O'Keefe, who, if anyone else, was at the house when you left?
I believe Chris Curran and his wife might have been there at one point. I think maybe the wife left, but he stayed. I believe maybe Mr. Curran, never met him before. I think they introduced him as Mr. Curran's brother. And then John's nephew. And I don't know if his niece was there. She might have been in the other room.
And the defendant, Ms. Reed, was she there as well?
Yes.
And as far as the Currans are concerned, are those people you're familiar with, and how do you know them?
Again, the Hillside. I met them there, and I believe through John O'Keefe.
How well did you know them at that point?
Not very well.
Now, you mentioned that John's nephew was there. Had you ever met him before?
No.
And what, if any, interaction did you have with his nephew while
Oh, no,
We were playing video games together.
And so the text, if I could direct your attention back to the text communications before you with Mr. O'Keefe on that last page. Specifically, there's text that exchanged between the two of you on Sunday, January 16th, correct?
I see the text.
That's about 9:30 in the morning, is that correct?
Mr. Lally, on this last page, which one is it? 1, 2, or 3?
About the middle of the page.
Thank you.
Can you repeat that again?
May I approach the witness?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to read. I apologize.
So I would direct your attention to right about there where it says Sunday, January 16th. You see that, sir?
Yes.
And that indicates about 9:33 in the morning.
Yes, I see it.
And if you could read from that text exchange, and if you know, if you could indicate sort of who's talking or who's saying it.
It says TF, hurting like this in 10 years. Haha. I'm not sure. I'm not sure who's saying that.
Not sure who's hurting and who's saying haha.
Well, I know I was definitely hurting that morning, but I'm not sure who was saying that.
And what, if any, other communication is there later on in the same chain?
All right, I see John. Was it necessary to introduce Hennessy XO? Was I really playing video games? That would have been me. And then it says, I blame Karen. Yup. And then I said, please tell me I didn't break your nephew's video game. If I did, I'll replace it. Did I throw a controller or some shit? And then it says, I don't think so. WTF, I'm hurting. How can you guys not be still in bed?
Is that the end of that
And then
specific conversation?
it appears to be, yeah. Yes.
Then the next conversation begins on what's indicated as Saturday, 12:20 a.m. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is it your recollection that that was January 29th?
Yes.
And is that the message that you sent to Mr. O'Keefe while you were in the residence at 34 Fairview Road?
Yes. I said, are you coming here with followed by 3 question marks?
And again, Mr. O'Keefe, based on your recollection and based on the records you have before, you never responded to that text. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you never saw him after that, correct?
Never again, no.
May I approach just to retrieve, Your Honor?
Yes.